Okay, welcome to UTOKing with Gregg. My very good friend,
Thank you.
Lene Rachel Andersen, philosopher, author, futurist leader, is here to dialogue today. There are two core concepts that I've been very deeply influenced by in our exchanges, seriously, and are now very much a part of my own way of thinking, and I really want to take this opportunity to get your rich thoughts on them. One of them is metamodernity, and the other is Bildung. And I think they are central concepts for us to be considering as we, well, reflect on this crazy place that we're in the 21st century and where we might want to go to saner and more fulfilling times. So with that, welcome.
Thank you.
So one of the things I thought, I have your book right here. Is I have the Metamodernity book over there. It's a beautiful Nordic Secret. And, you have a vision for how we might be socializing ourselves in educational contexts and where we might be going. And so let me just throw that out to you and see where you might want to take us in terms of what's on your mind. And
yeah, so I think both as societies, as a species, and as individuals, we're in a time and place in our evolution as, a species and as individuals where a lot of things are up in the air. A lot of things are changing very rapidly. A lot of people are, losing foothold. Our societies have institutions and legislation and education that are not up to the job anymore because it was created for the industrialized society in a modern world with, sovereign nation states behind relatively solid borders that hadn't been, broken down by the internet. So the way that you and I were brought up, but a lot of people were brought up and everything that everybody has learned in school, even though they're a lot younger than us, represents a world and an understanding of the world that, of course, still has value and is still very useful, but it's not enough.
Right.
So I'm not here to say that we have to throw everything out and change everything and come up with entirely new stuff. What I'm saying is that what we already know is not enough, and we need to add something to that.
Okay.
And whether you are a Western, well-educated, fortunate part of an academic tradition and, sort of in the sweet spot in our economy and civilization, or you belong to a minority, or you're are struggling in order to, pay your bills and stuff like that, whether you're part of a traditional society, maybe you're illiterate, maybe you are in an entirely different part of the world. All these societies and communities that we know today have things of value that is worth bringing into the future. The question is, of course, which parts are the best parts that enrich us, that makes life meaningful, that allow us to find life meaningful, that allow us to connect with other people, grow as individuals, have safe and coherent communities, societies, family relationships, and so forth.
Right.
And what is the contrary, and what does not, provide us these many wonderful and good things.
Amen.
And so whatever is meaningful and allows us to connect with other people in peaceful ways and give us comfort and meaning, we should, of course, bring that with us into the future. But it may not be enough. There may be things that, for instance, if you only had, 5 to 7 years of school, you simply do not know enough about the world to function in a globalized 21st century.
Right.
Maybe if you are, extremely well educated, went to Harvard, business school, law school, whatever, maybe even one of the natural sciences. Maybe you have a Newtonian worldview and you're really, really good at it. Maybe you are an expert in the American legislation, for instance. But it's the legislation of the 1980s or maybe even the 1960s. But you're really good at it. And anybody who looked at your career would be very impressed, but still it may not be enough. So we're all in a position where we need to expand our horizons and we need to understand the world in additional ways.
Right.
So we all bring something with us that is really valuable. We all need to learn new stuff and we all need to have conversations about this. So I would say that is where we are. And I think that whenever people talk about, so the future will be very different and we need new education, we need new knowledge, blah, blah, blah. A lot of people hear that, oh, then I have to get rid of everything that means that is important to me, that
right.
provides meaning in my life. And then people, get fearful, anxious, and perhaps even angry, and then we have the problems. So my first message would be, whatever you care about a lot, you should probably be able to bring that with you into the future. Yes, but we also have to have some conversations about, so what should the context be for it?
Right.
And what kind of communities would this be suitable for? Where would it fit in? And if we, and so this brings us to the part of the metamodernity, which is about cultural codes.
Right.
So,
you authored a book, Metamodernity, Hope and Change in a Complex World, or Hope?
Yes, exactly. Right? Hope. Yeah. And so I guess most people know that we live in the West, at least, in a postmodern world, and around the globe, people are being exposed to postmodernity and postmodernism. So the ironical deconstruction of everything of value, particularly the grand narratives. Most of us would also, I guess, in the West, think of our societies as modern societies. And what does that mean? Well, it means, for one thing, that we have separated religion and political power. So what is revelation? What is spiritual tradition? What is Bible or Quran or the Vedas or these, grand narratives that provide us with meaningful stories about what the good person is, what is right and wrong. We can have them as individual guidelines. We can have them as the family tradition. I mean, we can gain a lot of wisdom from them, but we cannot bring them into the political sphere because we cannot vote about the content, and we cannot, we can deconstruct the content, but some people will be hurt. So what we can do in the political sphere in the modern society is that we can bring science into the conversation and say, so what can we document here? What kind of facts are we basing this on? And then when we know the facts, we can say, I don't like it or I do like it. And now we can discuss whether we should do this or not. And if I'm a Christian or a Jew, I can bring in the Bible and say, my Bible tells me that this is right or wrong, but I cannot make the Hindu accept the biblical answer. On the other hand, the Hindu cannot tell me that Vishnu or Shiva brings me this insight, and so we should do like this. But what we can do as modern Democrats is that we can say, okay, can we find a common ground, or can we disagree, or can we agree on where to disagree, and then we can vote about what to do about this piece of fact or the situation that we're in. So I can absolutely have my religious moral compass as my inner guidance, but I cannot claim that other people must follow my religion, particularly not in politics. I can go to church and tell them that because that's what we have the churches for, but I can't do it in politics. So part of modernity is that we've separated, as we say, church and state, but really we've separated religion and politics. And that is what has given us this modern society and the modern liberties, political liberties, a lot of freedoms that we enjoy in the modern society. And we should still, enjoy these even in a postmodern era of the modern society. Before that, there was a traditional society, a pre-modern society. And that's where that's where we have the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, and where 3,000, 2,000, 1,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, what we know as religion today emerged. And before that, there were some prehistoric indigenous societies. So now we're going back to the Stone Age, both the hunter-gatherers and the earliest agricultural societies.
Right.
And they had.
So you break up, I'm sorry, you break up the sort of the evolution of cultural sensibility into these four domains, right?
Yeah.
The oral indigenous, the traditional pre-modern, the modern, and then the postmodern.
Yeah. Yes.
And part of the deal is to gain an understanding of each and the value of each.
So they provide different things to our lives. And so if we take the oldest part, and I mean, so 200,000 years ago, genetically modern humans were around. And they, multiplied and spread around the globe. And around the globe, they met different climates and different environments and adjusted their behaviors and their narrative, their traditions, their tools, everything. But there are a couple or several common denominators among these little groups. For instance, rarely did they become more than 150 people.
Right.
They did not amass more material wealth than they could carry with them. They were hunter and gatherers. They may have, made a campfire. They may have made a camp from time to time, particularly in the Arctic areas. They would have built igloos or other kinds of dwellings. But there was not enough people and not enough wealth around in order for there to develop hierarchies of wealth and power. There were people who had more power than others, but there wasn't institutionalized power, and there wasn't, a king with soldiers.
Right.
So what we have in these small communities, which would on a day-to-day basis be large families of, 3 or 4, 2 or 3 generations probably, would be that everybody could check the body language of everybody. If you had a situation, you could talk to everybody. Everybody would actually chat to each other during the day. You could have eye contact. So you could regulate the group by conversation and reading body language. And you can do that in a small group, and that's what we do in the family. Yeah. And we need this. I mean, we can't be people without this kind of intimate relationships where we can connect emotionally with the others.
That's right.
But then when we get into the larger societies, and so let's say we get to the, Stone Age village with maybe 2,000 people, then you get a different kind of power structure, but you can still know everybody, or at least know of everybody in the larger clan. And so you can still regulate the social structure by, there would probably be some kind of chieftain who beat up somebody from time to time. But other than that, you could still regulate by personal, interaction. Yep. But when you get to a Bronze Age society of 5,000 people in a ring-walled city, you can't do that anymore. Right. And so they actually invented written legislation. It took a couple of thousand years, but they did.
Hammurabi's code and whatnot.
Yeah, exactly. So Middle East, Babylonia, Mesopotamia. So now we have a different kind of regulations of social interactions. Right. And in these societies, they develop narrative and written legislation as the tools for keeping people, keeping social calm within the larger society. And we also need this because we are parts of larger groups. This could be a village, a city, town. It could also be a workplace. It could be one of those large companies that people spend a lot of time in, usually the best hours during the week. And there we need rituals, we need written legislation, we need rules, and we need a sense of community that's based on something else, and where we regulate behavior and conflicts, not least, through a different kind of social interaction and sort of written law.
So these are the emergence of what I would call then systemic, large-scale systems of justification that are then given some sort of identity, group coordination, group flavor that's not manageable at the face-to-face or relational level.
And so imagine if you took the face-to-face regulation mechanism into this larger structure. Then you would have either a mayor or a CEO or somebody else leading this group, or a pastor for that matter in a church. And he or she would have to interact personally with everybody in order to make sure that people didn't get into fights and disagreements and, cheating each other or, just misunderstandings. And so it doesn't work. And likewise, it doesn't work if you try to regulate your family with written legislation. So it's like you call, 3 generations, everybody sit down in the living room, and now we write the laws for this family.
Right.
That would get any family to fall apart immediately.
Of course.
So depending on the group size, there are different ways of interacting.
Right.
And then in the modern world, we get to these million-strong societies. It can be, authoritarian nation states, or it can be democratic nation states.
Right.
But here we have a whole different kind of written legislation. And one of the reasons that we can have democracies in such large societies is that we have the means of communication technologies that allow people to have a public sphere where we can discuss politics. And so the difference between the pre-modern larger society and its written legislation is that the pre-modern legislation was typically religious. Somebody had a revelation and said, ooh, the gods or God want the legislation to be like this. And everybody could just agree or lose their head or something.
Right.
In the democratic nation state, we disagree on the legislation, and we ping pong ideas, and we, write letters to the newspapers, or we go to political meetings, or we join a political party, and then we have the discussions at big meetings. And then eventually we vote for politicians who represent us, and then they create the legislation, and then they, come up with a result, and then we say, damn it, I want to vote for somebody else next time. So we have a process around this, and we can have this process because of the communication technologies that we have. And
And this happens in terms of the Renaissance into Enlightenment about 500 years ago.
So the printing press, newspapers. And actually an interesting thing about newspapers is that they are very much part of the process that allows us to have a sense of national identity and cohesion, because what you have with a newspaper is that it travels across long distances. And then people, 300 miles away, read about, what goes on in the Capitol, or what goes on with, the war at the border, or other people in another city have this fight with, a rich, industrialist who does something that people disagree with. Whatever kind of news, start traveling in writing in the 1700s. And that suddenly allows the bourgeoisie to get a sense of, there are people far away that I've never met who speak and read the same language as me, and they're struggling with the same issues as I am. So this can be in the old world, in Europe, where it was very much about the political power was the royalty, but it could also be in the United States or Canada and the colonies, where people had a conflict with, of course, the old world and the king, but also with each other in the colony. So suddenly there's this new kind of awareness about, we're a group of people where everybody does not know everybody anymore, and wonder how many people we are. Maybe we're 100,000, maybe we're 1 million. And we have to make this society function. And so we're going to write these opinion pieces in this new invention called the newspaper. And then based on that, you have gradually a political process that is emerging, and then we're creating these nation states that we know today.
So we're seeing a real transition in the cultural consciousness as a function, in part, both the levels of organization and the technologies for communication are transforming that organization as well.
And that is where we are with the digital media right now. We're meeting on Zoom. So on, different continents and different time zones. And we have to coordinate this. And then we have daylight savings time that's just, messing it up 1 hour. And we couldn't figure out which way it was going. So our human brains were not made for time zones, okay?
No, this is So there's a couple of really important points here that I think we're building to, and that is, so there's then the transition in terms of the cultural sensibility from oral to indigenous into pre-modern. Then we get into pre-modern, which is governed by sort of macro level religious, legal nation states. Then there's a transformation.
Or city-states, actually, and empires.
Really, yeah, actually, and then into empires. But the ethos that governs it is mostly this sort of national religious ethos. And then we get into a transition in relationship to liberal democracy. And there's this scientific revolution also in relationship to
So we start documenting things and try to find out, so what is actually real? What is the objective truth outside our heads, which we can coordinate?
Right.
And we don't just, I mean, if I came to you 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago and said that God spoke to me and we now must all go towards the east and say hello to the sun every morning. Mm-hmm. If I had the right kind of charisma and did this with, sufficient enthusiasm, and maybe some power. If I could get you to follow and get more people to follow, people would accept that. And they would just say, oh, the prophet said that the God said so, and we need to do this.
Right. But
in a modern world, people will be like, yeah, really? Based on what did you experience that? So we don't take that kind of revelation as a shared truth anymore. And we don't base our, societal development on it. Right. We may built on a religious heritage and have our religious communities doing that. And that's okay, because it provides a different kind of cohesion and moral values and, framework around the, larger existential issues. But it cannot be part of the modern political discourse, because the modern political discourse needs to be based on the shared objective reality outside of our heads. And then of course, I know that science is a process and we're just, testing hypotheses and we get new answers all the time. But that's the point. It's not like one scientist comes out and says, now we know nano, and this is what nano is like. Because there will always be other scientists saying, yeah, we agree that a nanometer is about this long, depending on the length of the meter. But apart from that, we have to disagree because I saw something that you didn't see. And then we're testing who got closest to what everybody can agree on, or at least what nobody can prove wrong.
Right.
So it's a different kind of process. And in a democracy, in a modern democracy, we have to have that kind of science as part of the foundation for the political decisions. And then, of course, you have politicians and moral values negotiating. So what should we think of this? And what should our legislation be like based on this kind of knowledge?
Right.
So it's a different kind of situation.
Amen. And so one of the things that I'm going to throw out a sentence here and see if you can see what your reflections are, because this is really speaks to, I think, some of the conversations that are happening in this sort of, general, larger metamodern meta space. And this is a deep concern of mine in relationship to the relationship of the traditional worldview, the modern worldview, the postmodern worldview, and what will be a sustainable metamodern sensibility. And one of the things I'm involved in, as I think in terms of my own exploration, I just want to get your read on this. And I'm searching for a coherent naturalistic ontology that revitalizes the human soul and spirit in the 21st century. Sort of like, what are your, I know you think a lot about these kinds of issues, and in terms of both the metamodern sensibility, ultimately Bildung, looking across these sensibilities, what's your kind of assessment of the need for that, where we are in relationship to that, what ought to we be doing to find our direction in these regards?
Yeah, that's why I think that the metamodernity, as I define it, can help us, because we need that prehistoric indigenous part of life where we have intimate communities or relationships, the tiny clan, the larger family. It takes a village to raise a child, as they say.
Right.
We need that kind of tiny village. We also need the pre-modern religious narrative and revelation-based community where we have aesthetics and a tradition and a framework for the big transformations in our individual lives, from a child to adult, or a child to teenager, teenager to adult. Marriage, we ought to have some sort of ritual for divorce, actually. And then, of course, death, birth, for that matter. So we need these big, transitions in our individual and family lives to have a framework. We need the modern world and everything that brought us with democracy and science and equality and so forth. And then we need the postmodern insights of perspective taking and context, and that we can, in fact, deconstruct everything that came before it. But if we keep deconstructing everything, life becomes meaningless, because then there is nothing of true, real, and deep value. And we need things of true, deep, and real value. And both the modern world, the pre-modern world, and the indigenous prehistoric world, provides us with this.
Afford us that, yeah.
Exactly. And so we need to have some of all of that and bring it with us into the future. And that's why I started by saying that whatever is really dear to you, you will most likely, unless it's either sadistic or destructive for other people, you can bring that with you into the future, but you have to add something. So if you live in a pre-modern context, in a strictly religious traditional society, and your entire worldview is based on a religion, I'm not going to take your religion away from you. I mean, I can't. But what I'm going to suggest is that you need to add something to that approach to life, which is the modern part, because having these pockets of pre-modern theocracy in a world with nuclear weapons and social media and nanotechnology and killer drones and bunch of stuff is, we're not going to be safe around each other unless we all learn to handle ourselves in democratic open structures and by taking, political responsibilities as adult citizens. We also need to have that postmodern understanding of religion having evolved in a historical context. Doesn't mean that it's without value. It just means that it emerged out of a context, and it provided one kind of value. And so the indigenous prehistoric culture provided a different kind of value. And so did the modern world, and so did the postmodern world. And we need all of it. And we can only live in peace around each other if we realize this, and if we allow it for ourselves and for others. And so here, there are a lot of challenges to this, and this will demand a huge change in our educational systems, in our culture, in our political lives, in our priorities. Right. And so this is where Bildung comes into the play.
Yes, absolutely. So this is a good transition point then a bit. So let me just summarize though, and I'll speak to my own experience with metamodernity and its meaningfulness, because I actually found that my own work in psychology, I think basically was really, I didn't have the word for it 10 years ago or whatever, but I was searching for an integrative, pluralistic, postmodern grand meta-narrative that pulled together lots of key insights in an assimilative, integrative, coherent sort of way. And then when I stumbled across the metamodern movement that you are one of the major leaders in, there was a resonance with regards to the way in which it positioned. And in fact, I actually particularly like metamodernity because of the way it positions these four cultural codes or sensibilities and highlights the value in them and the possibility of assimilating and integrating the values across them and cultivating the kind of sensibility in the 21st century that we need. So I think I just wanted to sort of summarize that because I think it's a beautiful and important frame of reference that is catching a little bit of fire, but I think we want to see what we can do to advance that term and concept. And then there's this whole issue about, well, how do we actually relate to each other and find pathways so that people are actually positioned to cultivate a sophisticated, rich, metamodern sensibility. And you've done very good work in relationship to educational philosophy and a vision for education around this concept of Bildung.
Yeah. So, yeah, I'm sorry to have to introduce a German word into the English language, but
Right.
I mean, there's already Gesundheit and Schadenfreude,
Right.
and people don't seem to have a yeah, exactly, and people don't seem to have a problem with any kind of new digital platform called Uber or Skype or whatever. So Bildung.
Go with it. Yeah. Bildung it is.
Bildung it is. And I mean, the word build in German means image. So originally, Bildung was about shaping yourself and your character in the image of Christ. So I mean, we're like 500-600 years back in time where as part of the early Renaissance, there was this pietism. And the first people who went to the United States were part of that movement, actually. So they were the religious Christians who had, I mean, so if we go back 600 years to the medieval Europe,
right?
It was Christian, but it was Christian in a way where people weren't really aware of it. It was just the way of life. It's like the traffic rules today.
Right.
I don't confess to a different kind of, one particular kind of traffic rules. When I go out into the street, I just accept that the car is driving the right-hand side of the street, and I stop at a red light. Whether I'm a pedestrian or driving a car, that's just the way it is. Unless I'm in the UK, then they're driving the left side of the street, but they still have to stop at a red light.
Yes.
So it wasn't part of people's identity. It was just the way that things were. There were some Jews and some other minorities, but apart from that, people were just, religious in the way that they were told to be.
Yeah.
But then in the 1600s, you have these this movement of pietism, and it was a new kind of connecting emotionally with your religion, and so it was a spiritual awakening. And suddenly Europeans discover, part of Europeans, and mainly, I guess, higher bourgeoisie women, actually, and some people in the aristocracy. It wasn't the peasants. It was very much among women. So they started realizing that they could actually feel this spirit and the connection to Christ, and it became quite intense. And so you had these new movements within Christianity. It was also after the Reformation. It was part of the Protestant, different Protestant groups. And so religion suddenly became a personal choice in a different way than it had ever been before. And of course, these many groups couldn't stand each other. And if you were believing in the wrong way, you were, a heretic. And there was like things, so you had all these people who immigrated to the colonies in order to live a life in religious freedom. But what's interesting here is that in the German culture, the first Bildung was actually to have this image of Christ and shape your character according to it, and having these intense feelings about spiritual connection. And then in the mid 1700s, this kind of religiosity kind of went out of fashion and was replaced with a rational enlightenment. And a lot of people were spiritually starving because now the rational thinking took over everything. And there was among German philosophers people who kind of rediscovered that emotional life and having a moral development. And you could actually, and that's what they discovered, the image could be the image of your individual personal character.
Mm.
And who are you as an individual, and how can you grow to become all that you can be, as the saying goes. So Bildung became the individual personal development towards, it's both the process and the result, the development towards personal autonomy. And by personal autonomy, now we're getting into your field of psychology. I mean, what they were saying in the 1770s and 80s is, or was, extremely close to modern developmental psychology today. Where you have somebody like Jean Piaget, who was studying child development psychology.
Yep.
You had Lawrence Kohlberg, who was exploring moral development. And, you know, more names of psychologists today. I refer to Robert Keegan, who's not actually a psychologist, but works with leadership development at Harvard Business School.
Right.
But what modern developmental psychology says, you can, you know, explore this in more detail or in broader strokes. But one model has 5 stages.
Right.
There's actually 6, because there's between 0 to 2 years of age is not really part of the model. But the sort of the first phase of childhood after having been a toddler is then early childhood from 2 to 6 years of age, where you are in the throes of your instincts.
Yep.
And you learn to control these and sort of, you know, see them as something you can control, but you're still had by your emotions. That is why whenever you see a ball, you know, flying into the street, you kind of know that there's going to be a child after it. So if you're in your car and you see a ball rolling across the street, you hit the brakes, because children don't know that you can't just follow a ball when it rolls into the street. So age 6 to 12 is when you learn to control your emotions, and that kind of, you know, running after whatever, where the ball is going. You have to, you know, be able to stop yourself and carry yourself. And so you also go through a process of learning that the person that I am today is also there tomorrow. And you start creating peer groups and lasting relationships with your peers. And you can only do that because you have a lasting image of yourself. So if today I'm the person who prefers pizza to burgers, I will be the same person tomorrow, and tomorrow I will also prefer pizza to burgers.
Right.
And if I'm not a good sport today among my peers, they're not going to play with me tomorrow. So I gradually learn to, you know, play by the rules and be a good sport and all these things. And by the age of 12, I should have learned to do this.
Right.
But for a lot of things, I simply am not mature enough to make my own decisions or create the rules myself. I can negotiate them. I can also keep an appointment if it has been stated explicitly, but I have a hard time coming up with sort of the rules or the appointments or the negotiated agreements on my own. So we still, I mean, until the age of 10 or 12 years old, need a lot of adult supervision and sort of a framework around us. I mean, the good adult educator, be it a parent, a grandparent, or teacher, can see where the child's boundary of understanding goes, and then they will just provide the child with choices they can actually handle.
Right. Zone of proximal development.
Exactly. The good old Lev Vygotsky. When we get to our teenage years, something happens hormonally. And we are...
Ain't that the truth?
Been there, tried that, made a lot of mistakes.
All sorts of fun.
Yeah. So we get new needs and new inclinations. And what we're really looking for is, of course, to mate with somebody. And in a modern society, we can't have anybody do that until they're like 35 and have student debt. But our hormones are telling us around the age of 13 and 14, go procreate. And so what we're looking for are, first of all, to become good mates, but also somebody that the other adults can trust. And so we start internalizing the norms of society in order to show people that we can be trusted. And it's a really deep inclination in the teenager. I know that as a teenage parent, it may not actually always look like that, but they are really trying. They really want to. And the reason why they want to is because, you may be able to find a sexual partner without being trustworthy, but you're not going to find a set of in-laws without being trustworthy. So there is a deep inclination for us to internalize the expectations of others. And that's what's happening during the teenage years. And that's how we enter adulthood. And of course, as soon as you become a parent, you really want to be able to internalize the norms of society, because that's how you get others to take care of your children if something happens to you. So there is this socializing process also in young adulthood and in adulthood. And in modern psychology, it's called self-governing. And then eventually you can realize that I'm really living my life according to other people's expectations. Maybe I should, gain some autonomy. And from time to time, I completely disagree with my surroundings. Maybe I should, develop a moral backbone and be able to speak up to other people, even my closest relatives. And so that is when you become self-authoring, according, what it's called in Kegan and other parts of developmental psychology. And then beyond that, there is what Kegan calls self-transforming. But what is interesting from a Bildung perspective in these philosophers in the 1780s, 90s, is that the late childhood, what I call the self-consolidating phase, the self-governing phase in teenage years and adulthood, and the self-authoring phase in later adulthood, is actually described by these philosophers as Bildung. And so that really emotional development, they're using slightly different words, but it's obvious that they're saying the same thing.
Right.
And it's like 250 years apart, which is really interesting, or at least 200 years apart. So it's fascinating that what we think of as modern developmental psychology was actually described by people living in a feudal society 200 years ago in ring-walled cities. And this was the frustrated bourgeoisie who were, they were fed up with these authoritarian rulers, and some of them were really nasty. There were some of them, if you said the wrong thing to them, you just ended up in jail and there were no courts, and you could just sit there and rot it. Until you didn't exist anymore. So in this environment, there were thinkers who discovered this kind of a development. And my biggest, my absolute favorite is Friedrich Schiller. And the interesting thing with relation to our times is that he connected this to who can handle political freedom. So what he said was that the first kind of people, so this is what I would say, the self-consolidating late childhood adult.
Okay.
Because he was only talking about adults. He wasn't talking about children. So he said, and he called them the emotional people. So these emotional people who are controlled by their emotions, they cannot handle political freedom, because whenever there's a conflict, they will just, go with their emotions. And so you cannot trust them. And he wrote this in the aftermath of the French Revolution. So if they're, angry with the ruler and they start a bloodbath, they'll just, keep making bloodbath. They can't stop themselves once they're angry.
Right.
Then there's the second group of people, which is what we would then call the self-governing people today, and which Friedrich Schiller called the people of rationality. So the people who were following the rationale of society. They would, since they're taking their guidance from other people, in case of a crisis or revolution, they would just follow the most agitated people, which would be the first group of people. And so if they were starting a revolution and a bloodbath, the self-governing people would just continue the riots and the bloodbath. So they could not be trusted with political freedom either. And what Schiller said was the only people who can be trusted with political freedom would then be the free people, the moral people, what we would then call the people with autonomy or self-authoring people. And why is that? Well, because if there is a revolution or a riot or an insurrection against the Capitol, they would say, no, dear people, you're allowed to be angry, but you cannot use violence. You have to stop. And then we have to talk about this, and we have to come up with a solution. And you can't just, take people to the gallows without having a, court of law.
Right.
And that is how you handle political freedom. And the process towards this kind of autonomy, self-authoring, is Bildung, but it's also the result of Bildung.
Okay.
So we can describe Bildung, and so what's interesting and what distinguishes Bildung from developmental psychology is that it also has the aspect of education built into it.
Right.
Because developmental psychology is really just, and I hope I'm not offending you as a psychologist, but
I'm not a developmental psychologist. Screw him.
So,
maybe Zach Stein would be offended, but whatever.
Let's see about that. But he also writes about pedagogy and
right, he's in there.
So he
can build that bridge.
He can handle it, I think. But so modern psychology is an analytical tool. It can help you figure out where are people in their lives emotionally, morally, with regards to their maturity and the way that they perceive the world, but it's not a teaching tool. What's interesting about Bildung is that it says we also need to have culture built into this. We need to teach people something so that they can get this kind of Bildung. And what do we teach them? Well, first of all, we use the aesthetics, because what are the aesthetics? That's an emotional expression.
Okay.
So in order to make that transformation from being the person who is in the throes of his or her emotions and to turn them into self-governing people who can take responsibility according to the norms of society, we need to help these people align their emotions with the rest of society. And we can do that through the arts. We can do that through music. We can do that through paintings. We can do it through literature. So we do that through storytelling. And that is, I mean, it's not like me telling you, you cannot do this or you must do that, or the right moral behavior is such and such. What we do is we say, explore this emotion and get to know yourself with this emotion through the arts. Or read this novel and let's have a conversation about it. How do you relate to this character? And what is great about a great novel, for instance, is that you can relate to people who live completely different lives from the way that you live your life. And so you can identify with somebody going through an emotional process that is not your own. But you can still experience some of the same emotions because you identify with the character.
Right.
And you experience how you would react in the situation that this character is in.
Right.
And that is, I mean, if it's crap literature, you're not going to get that experience. But if it's good literature, if it's well written, you will get that experience. Right. And so you can train your emotional muscle to get experiences from different, fields of life than you would ever encounter otherwise.
Yeah.
And so that is part of your Bildung. And then when you have aligned your emotions and your values and your behavior with society, it's time for you to wake up and feel your own emotions again and figure out for yourself what is morally right or wrong. And there you can use the arts again, and you can, wake people up and shake them up and get them to feel outraged or angry or, caring or whatever about something that would, get them to start thinking about, am I just following the expectations of others, or am I actually making up my own mind?
Right.
So what I really like about the concept of Bildung is that in order for us to provide good education, we need to focus on the aesthetics. We need to focus on cultural heritage. We need to focus on religion. We need to focus on the great narrative, the grand narratives. And we also need to focus on conversation and philosophy and critical thinking and get people to relate personally to the things that they're being taught or the knowledge that is out there that they're not being taught, so that they go and ask for it themselves because they realize that there's knowledge that I do not have. I ought to have this. Somebody cheated me and did not teach me this in school.
Amen.
So that is Bildung, and so it's more than developmental psychology, but the developmental psychology is in there.
Well, that's what it's. So many things about this are striking to me. First off, it's really cool as a psychologist to see how early this developmental stage theory appears. And second, as a parent of three who go through public school systems, so we were able to channel them in pretty good public school systems. But there is a base, I would say, from what I would say, my wife is very much involved in the system, essentially a complete lack of philosophical reflection about character development in any type of stage. There's no education about emotion. There's no notion of pre-conventional, conventional, post-conventional. There's no pulling individuals into themselves, thinking about society, reflecting back, and then growing out of. I mean, none of that is part of the structure and philosophy that guides that process. And it's really strikingly absent, especially when you lay it out that folks have been thinking about this, hundreds of years ago.
Right. And in fact, I mean, one of the Bildung thinkers was Wilhelm von Humboldt, who was actually the Minister of Education in, what would that be, Prussia, like 1809 to 1811, not for a long time, but enough that he shaped the university, the classical university of the Western tradition. And even in the United States, I mean, there was so much conversation going on across the Atlantic back then, and we also tend to forget that. I mean, the Statue of Liberty was actually a French donation. So, right. So, I mean, there was a lot of interaction and intellectual correspondence and correspondency among those two continents. But So the idea of this, it's built into the American college system. It's built into the liberal arts programs. And so it is the philosophy also behind the Anglo-Saxon educational university college tradition. But over the past 40 to 50 years, we have marketized everything and sort of kicked out anything that does not improve, the access to the workforce, exactly, to the workforce. So we are actually making ourselves dumber, a lot dumber than we could have been. And one of the reasons is that we have, aesthetics, that's just icing on the cake. Philosophy, icing on the cake. Narrative and religion, go, if you want to be a pastor and become a theologian, you can study that. But we don't, a science program, and I'm talking about the natural sciences as well as development of technology, does not have, and they really should have. I mean, we have this whole thing about the two cultures. Just like the liberal arts students should learn the STEM, the science and technology and engineering and math, all of the STEM people should learn the cultural heritage. And we should have the dialogue, because we're going to tear our civilization apart if we don't have that. Because what we're having right now is technologies that are disrupting not just the political structures and power structures, but also because they go worldwide, and the market is the only narrative that anybody can agree upon. They're just tearing all the traditions apart. And so everybody is becoming this market zombie instead of becoming both an active player in the economy and a religious person and a moral person and an autonomous person and somebody with a personal aesthetic taste and the ability to, play an instrument, sing in a choir, tell a story at a dinner party, all these things that make life interesting and meaningful, and where you can really show what matters to you and what, resonates with you, particularly that resonates with you as an individual, and not just, anything you just picked up on television yesterday or stumble upon on the internet and YouTube. So that sense,
And you're working we're trying to spread the Bildung message, right? In relationship. What's your thoughts and visions about what might advance this conception.
Right.
and
So
what's it-
Right. So 3 years ago, I wrote a book called The Nordic Secret. I developed it with a Swedish colleague. And it's about how this Bildung concept traveled from the German philosophers to Denmark and became folk Bildung. So we popularized it and didn't just give it to the bourgeoisie, but also to the peasants. And so we lifted the Danish society from the bottom through this kind of rich, broad, deep education.
Okay.
And the same thing happened in Norway, Sweden, and Finland. And so that is the Nordic secret. Now I revealed it. Oh. So
I thought it was just think positive.
yeah.
No, that's the other secret.
No, that's somebody else. No. We have the Scandinavian noir. We're like, based on this book, and particularly because David Brooks wrote about it in the New York Times. Actually, based on the book, we started a think tank called Nordic Bildung, and that's where I spent most of the time, including now. And we wanted to take this Nordic heritage and get it out into the world. And because David Brooks wrote about the book in New York Times, people started contacting me from the United States. And while that was happening, we were starting a European Bildung Network, which has an annual European Bildung Day on May 9th, this year also on May 8th. And so we're bringing people together in Europe to talk about Bildung and how can we do this and what are the best practices and so forth. But now people have contacted me in the United States, and so we're starting a North American Bildung Network. And there are people in Brazil and Puerto Rico and Chile who are interested as well. So we're also starting a Latin American Bildung Network. The European Bildung Network has been sort of, working on it for 2.5 years now.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So, and the North American one is just, we've had some Zoom meetings for, once a month for 6 months, and we brought in more people, and now we've been sort of talking for about a year. And so we're trying to get Bildung, to introduce it as a concept in North America and get it, make it a household word in the English language, because then we can talk about this horizontal, expansion of your horizon into new kinds of knowledge, and the vertical development of your, emotional depth, cultural roots, cultural depth, and moral aspirations, and how we're going to, become better at integrating this into existing teaching and educational structures.
Right. So is it fair to say then that you sort of have this metamodernity view of the cultural sensibility of what we can transition into in terms of pulling from cultural consciousness, and the Bildung represents then this character, educational, system developmental view that we can then grow into, and those together really represent a particular kind of framing for cultivating ourselves in the 21st century?
That's my take on it, and those two things really go together. And I would also say that, throughout these 4 major cultural codes, you can subdivide them into smaller things, but this makes it more tangible. There is Bildung in all 4 of them, but of course, societal expectations look different in all 4 of them, and the way that you can grow as an individual is of course different. If you're in a small group of, 100 hunter-gatherers who live together all the time, and who have to be, who have to survive in nature, and then different kind of society in a ring-walled city or a traditional society with thousands of people, but where you have priests who tell you what is right and wrong. And then in a modern society where you have many viewpoints and you have to find your own character and your own viewpoints in that, multitude of rights and wrongs. And then in a postmodern society where we're trying to convince us that there is no right, there is no wrong, there's just, relationships, and everything is depending on context. And so Bildung in all of these four circumstances, of course, has a different, evolves in the individual under different circumstances. But we all have the same potential, and we all have, the possibility in all of these societies and different cultures to, become self-governing and eventually also to gain autonomy. But of course, personal autonomy looks very different in, New York City than on the African savannah.
Cool. Well, are there, so that covers the two major concepts that I was hoping we would touch on. Are there anything that's particularly, in addition to that, that's alive for you, or things that you would like to sort of cover in this dialogue?
Yeah, I think I've touched upon everything, but what I really want to emphasize is that the foundation of our societies and our freedoms. Of course, we need a functioning economy, but over the past 30 to 40 years, we have started focusing so much on money and the economy that we kind of forgot the rest. And I think that if we go to the average Western person and ask them, what is politics about? What should it be about? I bet that most people would say, but that's about the economy, or it's about taxes. And it shouldn't, it should be about that as well. But we've forgotten that politics is really about what are the moral values behind our society, and how do we make sure that everybody thrives in society. And the economy should really just be a tool in that political process where we try to figure out what would be the best way for most people to live, where we still take into account the well-being of the minorities who do not want to live like that, or who would not thrive in the same way as the majority. And how do we have meaningful conversations about where would we like to take this society? And if we have politicians who keep insisting that this is mainly about money and taxes and saving money, or if we pick a third topic, it's usually defense. Right now it's the corona, actually.
Sure.
But apart from that, how often do we have a really big public debate about school systems or our cultural institutions? The institutions that allow us to, understand the world that we're living in, the symbols that allow us to communicate and to express ourselves and be human in these huge societies. Culture and education really ought to be at the core of our societies. So that is one thing that I would say we really need to change our focus. And what's interesting about the corona pandemic is that suddenly all governments realized that, there's something that is more important than money. Suddenly governments realize that we don't have to just think about the economy all the time. There's actually something that is more important, which is that people survive and live in good health. And if we can take that with us as we exit on the other side of the pandemic,
right,
and have different conversations about, so what is really important? What is important in our societies? And what is the future that we would really like? And then we could turn the economy into a tool for that. And I think that one of the reasons why we also need good science education and the humanities is because we need to feed our imagination. And we need people who, study, sustainable food production and circular economy, different kinds of of understanding what is a healthy economy, biodiversity, of course, nature and the climate, all these things the more that we understand these, we can have meaningful conversations about, so what would the good society look like? What would the good life look like? What would be a meaningful family life 10 years from now or 100 years from now?
Right.
We never have those conversations in the, you may have them with colleagues or in corners of the public debate, but we don't have it as the big issues. And that is really where they ought to be. So Bildung is part of that, because that's where you get the, the understanding of in many kinds of directions. You need to understand different kinds of fields of knowledge in order to have meaningful conversations about where a society should develop.
Wonderful. All right. That sounds uplifting, inspiring. I couldn't agree more at the level of reflection about what our foundational values are, especially as this world changes so much based on the technology. It's in so much flux. Now is the time to reflect on these. And so thank you so much for sharing your wisdom in relationship to Bildung. And I hope that word spreads, and I hope metamodernity spreads also. I think the tandem of those two are brilliant frames and necessary frames for the situation we're in, and exactly the kind of vision of 21st century wisdom, knowledge construction that I'm looking to explore. So thank you so much for coming and share.
Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. Is there any place that folks should find you, or if we leave some notes in the show notes or anything along those lines?
Yeah, NordicBildung.org. That's our think tank. I have my own website called LeneRachelAndersen.com. And then there's something called the Bildung Rose. So you can just Google Bildung Rose and it will take you to our website. There's also a BildungRose.com website. So, and there will soon be a corner of the Nordic Bildung website where the North American Bildung group can be found, and also the Latin American one. So we're working on that.
Great. Fantastic. Yep. All right. Well, we'll put that down, and thank you so much. And let the Bildung Rose bloom.
Yes. Thank you.
All right.